for this morning, we have a guest on radio. And first off, I want to welcome Dr. Zayas for joining us on this morning's program. We would like to thank you for taking the time to speak with our members. This is a radio station for our community, and we are going to share this interview with other First Nations radio stations. And first off, Dr. Zayas, in 1989, the late Miguel Alfonso Martinez came to Onion Lake on his first visit on treaty study. You mentioned this important work in your press briefing yesterday. Can you tell our listeners why this is an important work with the United Nations system?
Primarily because the concrete problems of violations of treaty obligations, violations of international law, violations of commitments undertaken by the British Crown and by the European colonizers vis-a-vis the First Nations. This study shows the systematic violation of the treaties and the fact that the treaties still have validity, so that it would be justiciable to claim the respect of agreements that have been made generations ago. Miguel gave the issue of the indigenous visibility. This is an issue that was taboo, that was not on the table, that was not being addressed, and finally, with the prestige, with the authority of the Subcommission on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, here was a solid scholarly document making a call for reparations, making a call for respect for these treaties. What is needed, of course, is the political will to follow up on the recommendations contained in the report of Miguel Alfonso. In my own report to the Human Rights Council, that is document 24/38, which I presented to the Council on the 10th of September, I include as an annex 3 pages from the recommendations and conclusions of Miguel Alfonso in his report of 1999. And in my own recommendations, I asked the Council to entrust the advisory committee to follow up on this report. That is, to investigate to what extent the states have undertaken any act to revitalize, to revive, to implement the agreements with the indigenous. The problem has always been a problem of silence. It's a problem of not wanting to discuss your issue. And if and when the discussion does occur, it is a formality. You may be heard politely, courteously, and then nothing happens. Because the vested interests, these are the corporate interests, the interests of the mining industry, the extraction industry, the oil industry, are paramount, and the politicians listen more to the corporations and to these interests than they listen to the populations affected by their activities.
Mm-hmm.
You know the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the first step, is not what you would like to see. Does not give the First Nations effective sovereignty, does not give you effective control over your natural resources, does not give you reparation for the centuries of damage that you have suffered. On the other hand, it manifests a beginning of a consciousness on the part of politicians, civil society, that there is an outstanding issue, that there is an open account that has to be settled.
Mm-hmm.
And I would wish that the General Assembly follows my call for a world conference on the issue of self-determination today, not focusing exclusively on the First Nations of the United States, of Canada, of Alaska, etc., but also taking into account the interests of the native populations of Rapa Nui, of the Moluccans, of West Papua, of Australia and New Zealand, and the Mapuches of Chile, and the many other indigenous peoples who have not attained self-determination. There is a lot of talk about self-determination as a pillar of the United Nations, as a principle, even referred to as jus cogens, that is the Latin term for peremptory international law. That's the highest level of obligatory international law. But this is only talk. There is no implementation of self-determination except when there are economic interests that would allow a people or a country or a minority to attain a level of autonomy or even to secede.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that the international community approved the secession of Kosovo from the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But here you have geopolitical interests involved, and at present there are no geopolitical interests advocating granting more autonomy to the indigenous. On the other hand, if the indigenous succeed in putting their concerns in the public arena, if the United Nations holds a world conference on self-determination, and you can make your case public, I am persuaded that the sympathies of civil society, the sympathies of the intellectuals will be with you. And my hope is that the more progressive elements in the business community would realize that ultimately it's in their own interest to do justice and not just to run after short-term profit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the main problem in Western society is that it's a society of short-term profit. Not you, the indigenous, but our Western society is geared to a worldview which is very materialistic, a worldview of competition without solidarity, of competition walking over corpses, ignoring what harm is done to your competitors, and ignoring what long-term harm is done to the environment. In a sense, our Western society is stealing from future generations. We are destroying the planet, we're destroying the environment, and it's not us who will have to suffer the consequences, but it will be the First Nations of the United States and Canada, it will be the indigenous, it will be also future generations. So you have several questions, no doubt. So I'll take the second one.
You have answered pretty well most of the questions that I had prepared for you. And one of them was, of course, back in 2013, our nation had 23 First Nations that filed an urgent action with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination about the push on the legislative agenda of Canada. You have made a reference in your report to state governments pushing an agenda without our consent, and I think you explained a little bit. Maybe perhaps if you could explain a little bit more on how this relates to our submissions on the work that you were doing.
Well, it was a good move to make a submission to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And you should follow up on that and make sure that the expert in CERD understand not only the legal issues, but also the history behind it. Part of the problem with United Nations expert committees is that the members have an expertise in economics or in law or in philosophy, but they do not have the historical knowledge to be able to judge the context of your claim. So you have to teach little children. You have to feed them the information that they have not received from the media or from the, shall we say, incomplete education that we have in our colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm.
As far as my own recommendation, since democracy means participation, and participation must be effective, not just a formality, I have insisted that in all matters that affect a population, consultations must be held, but with all persons affected through their legitimate representatives, and not just through puppets or through individuals who have been chosen by the government as useful interlocutors, but who do not have authorities to represent their communities. So the principle of free and informed consent must be vindicated, and unless there has been full consultation and there has been free and informed consent, then whatever decision has been taken has no validity. And power, of course, will trump legitimacy. Power will ignore justice and equity. It's always been like that. But there are many people in civil society in the United States and in Canada and in other countries who sympathize with the interests of the indigenous and who would like to see an adjustment of the policies vis-a-vis the indigenous. I mean, there are a few signs. For instance, in 1993, President Bill Clinton issued an apology to the people of Hawaii for the 1893 overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii and for the violation of the self-determination of the Hawaiian people. In 2009, President Obama signed an apology to the American indigenous. The sad thing is that there has been no follow-up on these apologies. So a tree fell in the forest and nobody heard it.
Mm-hmm.
The media didn't pick it up, and also the academics, the universities, didn't pick it up. So they have not made it into a politically correct issue for general discourse. Similarly, in Australia, in 2007, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued an apology to the Aborigines of Australia, who had suffered not only land grab and resource grab and destruction of their culture, of their environment, kidnapping of their children, forced indoctrination of their children, etc. Now, in Australia, at least the courts did follow up on the apology, and some measures were adopted to minimally improve the situation of the Aborigines. I have the impression that the media in Australia is more accessible to the interests of the Aborigines than the media in the United States and Canada. But coming back to your submission to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I find that activating the mechanisms of the United Nations does bear fruit. And you should also, that is, the Canadian First Nations, could make better use of the Human Rights Committee, which has a procedure of individual complaints under the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. A number of indigenous groups have sent complaints to the Human Rights Committee, which have been dealt with, in some cases, with findings of violations of their rights under the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. There are some decisions that are disappointing, decisions that have not given redress to the indigenous, and all I can say and encourage you to do is don't give up. Even you have reason to be discouraged, persevere. Continue sending complaints. Send complaints also to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous, James Anaya, and you can also send communications to the independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, because the mandate creating my functions, that is Resolution 18/6 of the Human Rights Council, empowers me to study the implementation of self-determination throughout the world, to the extent that your communities are denied self-determination and have been spoliated and have been denied the enjoyment of your environment and of your culture, of your way of life, of your fishing and your hunting rights. There is justification to forward that to several United Nations instances for investigation and settlement. Of course, the implementation of decisions of the Human Rights Committee, of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or of the Rapporteur James Anaya, or my recommendations, depends on the political will of the country concerned. And in democratic countries, the political will depends on the media and depends on civil society and depends on the conviction of the intellectual community that reforms are necessary and must be carried out. But in order for civil society to act, for the universities and the intellectual community to make demands of the politicians, it is necessary that you make your concerns, your preoccupations, your complaints known to as many instances as possible, so that gradually your issues become visible. As I said earlier, the crime of silence explains much of the misery that you suffer, because the tree fell in the forest and nobody heard it. So you must concentrate on disseminating information about your concerns, which are legitimate, and no one can deny the justice of giving you redress. But there are interests that would silence your concerns and your preoccupations, because these interests are making huge profits at your expense, and they want to continue doing so. So I think you had some more questions.
Thank you for joining us on our radio program, and we do appreciate you taking the time to join us.
It is my pleasure. If you want to contact me, my email address is IE-internationalorder@OHCHR.org. I repeat, IE for international, IE for independent experts, -international order, in one word, at OHCHR, which stands for Office High Commissioner Human Rights